Shalom, shalom, family. This is Elder Roth coming to you live. Shabbat shalom, family. Those who are in the observance, in the time of their rest, giving all praises to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, our ancestors, to Yeshua, the Mashiach, Yahweh Shai, to the one that those who ignorantly called him Jesus the Christ. I pray that your week, your day has been prosperous. Pray that the Most High has kept his arms of protection around you and your family as you go to and fro throughout the highways and the byways. Give all praise to the Most High God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh. He woke us up this morning, clothing our clothed in our right mind, the activities of our limbs, as the old folks used to say. Peace and blessings to you, family. I'm a little bit late coming in. It takes the meetings today and some family issues I had to deal with. But here we are. I wanted to come on and just share just a little bit, just some of the things, just some information, the things, discussions that have been going on. These are not new discussions. These are not new arguments, but oftentimes out of these older discussions, new information has to be presented, or information has to be brought to the forefront when there are things that are espoused that are simply not true historically, especially when it comes to the topic of slavery in the Bible. I've taught and debated many times, and still do, that the Bible, the biblical narrative, does not condone chattel slavery or the owning of a person, as we see in what most of us correlate to antebellum slavery in the South. Oftentimes, we didn't see Israel practice slavery as we see or familiar with in the movie Roots, right? We didn't practice that familiar institution of slavery, right? But oftentimes, where the English translation often fails us is that it doesn't give us the in-depth understanding into the culture and the understanding and the workings of the institution itself, and how these things were practiced when we talk about the word slave when it comes to the biblical narrative. Oftentimes, the word obed is often misunderstood in the scripture, right? There are categories of what slavery or what an obed was, right? And so oftentimes I teach that it could be a person, according to the biblical narrative, a person that owed restitution, who had to work off a debt for something that they owed. A person who volunteer servitude would have been called an obed or a slave, or a person that was a criminal, right, and had to do a bid or a time or pay time for the crime that they committed. They would be called an obed or a slave, right? Often not understanding that in that sense, handmaids and bondmaids and manservants were also included in those phrases. But oftentimes it's completely misconstrued, and it's smashed together with the modern understanding of what we understand in America, in Black America, is what a slave is and what a slave constitutes. And so we sort of conflate the two, but the institutions were completely different to a degree, specifically when it comes to how Israel in the Bible and the biblical narrative played a role in dismantling and tearing down and being in opposition to that particular institution. But what I really wanted to get into today is that oftentimes we hear that in the critique of the Bible's use of the term slave and what they misunderstand the word obed to be in the Bible, that they often say that because of that, we can contrast that with ancient Kemet, and oftentimes in ancient Kemet, that slavery was not common, or that even slavery didn't exist. All right. Chris Harris did a stream a few days ago, going through some sources, completely outdated sources and unreliable sources, saying that slavery was not common. Shadow slavery, to be more exact, that shadow slavery was not common in ancient Kemet. And that's wholly untrue. Doesn't matter what dynastic period you go to, it's wholly untrue. And so oftentimes, let me read this a little bit. And so oftentimes, we hear these things and information is presented, and without a proper rebuttal or proper counter argument or addressing a lot of the fallacies that are given on these particular topics, people walk away with a false understanding or question whether or not the Bible has any integrity, or whether or not the Bible or the biblical narrative should be trusted because it talks about an institution of slavery, right? Without understanding the culture of it at that particular time. And to simply say, well, slavery is slavery. That's a fallacy simply based on your confirmation bias towards the Bible itself. Well, when we talk about it again, the institutions that we see that was an oppressive institution of slavery, we clearly see it, the laws in ancient Israel completely went against those things. I often pose the question when it comes to chattel slavery, where do chattel slaves have rights? In any society that implemented or practiced the use of chattel slavery, right? So we have to often bring these things to light. And I also wanted to post another question as well. Where are the in the negative confessions of Ma'at? Where are the laws that said I have not enslaved another? Because clearly, even if you say it wasn't common, clearly the poor or the noble or the nobility or the pharaohs themselves clearly had slaves. So where's their negative confession dismissing or saying, listen, slavery is wrong. I have not enslaved another. But we read in Deuteronomy chapters 25, 24 and 25, that we should not oppress another man because we were once slaves in a strange land. That Israel should not oppress another man. But simply stating the negative confessions of Ma'at, where is it to be found? Where is it to be found? That you're not to have slaves or oppress another. Where is it to be found? You can't simply say, well, let's look at the 7 principles of Ma'at and let's see no. Where is the law, the codified law, which didn't exist, I mind you. Let's put that out there. There's no codified law of Ma'at that exists until the 7th century BCE. And that's a fact. Until we see the Greco-Romans come in and began to acculturate the ancient Kemet, then you began to see something codified. But before that time, it does not exist. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. There's no codification of Ma'at, of the laws of Ma'at, specifically, if anywhere, about anything, but more specifically about slavery, against the institution of slavery and chattel slavery in ancient Kemet. And so we're going to get into some sources. We're just going to read something really quickly. Let me share my screen. Let me share my screen. I won't be before you long. Here we go. And I believe we're sharing here, right? And this is Slavery and Servitude, right? From UCLA, Encyclopedia of Egyptology, from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, right? And so we're going to be talking about the 2012 lecture or paper, the research dealing with the authors Antonio Lupriano. And so let's take a brief look. Antonio Lupriano, University of Basel, citation 2012 Slavery and Servitude. And this is what we're going to get into, right? So this is a peer-reviewed paper, peer-reviewed article and publication. As you see here, it has a November 21st, 2012 publication date in the series of UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology, in the journal, published in the Journal of UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology, right? So this is a peer-reviewed paper, peer-reviewed research here. And again, here's the author, Antonio Lupriano, Slavery and Servitude, right? We're talking about slavery and servitude in ancient Kemet. So let's deal with the main content, right? I won't go through the abstract. But I do want to get into the main content. I want to get into the main content. Let's see, that might help people be able to see it better. All right. So this is UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology again. Peer-reviewed article here, peer-reviewed paper here. And so let's get into it. Let's just read a few things. Egyptologists feel insecure when discussing slavery in Pharaonic Egypt. Help, 1984. Since the very hypothesis of the existence of such an institution is a subject of debate among social and economic historians. See discussions by me in 2004, page 237, Hoffman 2005. From biblical times, Western culture has maintained a view of Egypt as house of slavery, Exodus chapter 20, as a civilization whose wealth was founded on forced labor. On the other hand, the virtual absence of legally codified slavery in a society so keen on written documentation cannot be accidental. Right? Evidence shows that the semantics of the Egyptian terms for slavery or servitude rather reflect social economic dependency than legal status. Although a few documents, such as the so-called adoption papers, as we'll look at below, do display legal concerns. Many social groups referred to in royal decrees and administrative texts were certainly subject to restrictions on individual freedom. In the Old Kingdom, royal corvée workers, right? And these are corvée workers or workers who, for a period of time, when the king or the vizier puts out a decree that these men, these workers, these laborers had to leave their homes and come work on certain building projects, right? And they could be gone for 3 to 4 to 6 months at a time, right? But they had to do it. It was mandatory. You didn't have a choice. You pretty much were drafted into labor for a period of time. And as we'll go through this information, and we'll see that it's this institution of corvée that oftentimes when they tell you, oh, well, we see in ancient Kemet that they didn't have slaves because they paid their workers. Well, these particular workers, or these corvée workers or laborers, they were paid a wage. But that wasn't the institution of slavery. Slavery was a viable living institution, not the corvée decree or institution. Something completely different here. So already we see, family, that a lot of times when we hear these guys talk about, well, there was no slavery in ancient Kemet because look, we know the workers were paid. No, those were drafted workers to work on specific building projects for a certain period of time. That was a forced labor society, but it was another class of slaves. There was another class of slaves that existed, and it was very common. There was an everyday institution, an everyday practice, a servitude of chattel slavery and perpetual slavery that occurred throughout all dynastic periods in ancient Kemet. So when you hear these guys say, oh no, it wasn't common, they're lying. It's not true. It's unfounded. They simply take you to the institution of corvée, of the corvée laborers, or those that were drafted to work on building projects for a specific period of time. But there was another class of slaves who were not paid a wage, who did not have rights, who could not return to their families, who were passed down from family to family, from pharaoh to pharaoh, from generations on in. And we're going to get into that, right? Where are we? Codified slavery society cannot be accidental. Evidence shows that the semantics of the Egyptian terms for slavery or servitude rather reflect social economic dependency. Although a few documents, such as the so-called adoption papyrus, do display legal concerns, many social groups referred to in royal decrees and administrative texts were certainly subject to restrictions on individual freedom. In the Old Kingdom, royal corvée workers undertook coercive labor for a certain period of time, but not for life. While from Dynasty 6 on, dependents represent the body of servants and laborers of a private or public domain. From the first intermediate period on, servants appear employed in households, while royal laborers are state employees who can also be allocated to private individuals. In addition, throughout Egyptian history, and increasingly during the New Kingdom, war prisoners and conscripts also appear employed in large-scale forced labor, so that the interpretative issues are in fact, at least in part, determined by terminology. Anthropological analysis point to the generally complex semantics of slavery. In some African rural cultures, for example, one's own children can be sold as property. The practice of selling children for work is also known in different forms in modern Europe. In this respect, it is interesting to note that in an Egyptian household of the Middle Kingdom, servants are considered part of the family structure. And we can see that on Stele MMA 12-18, 12-184, 10-182, C7, 1959, where it reads, I was someone beloved by his community, forthcoming to his family. I did not neglect those who are in servitude, although historical, administrative,
or legal texts are usually the most important source of our understanding of slavery. It should be kept in mind that Egyptian biographies and royal inscriptions are heavily influenced by the literary style, which limits their reliability as historical sources.
I need to read that again. I need to read that again.
Although historical, administrative, or legal texts are usually the most important source for our understanding of slavery, it should be kept in mind that Egyptian biographies and royal inscriptions are heavily influenced by the literary style, which limits their reliability as historical sources. Let's go into the literary text. It may be inappropriate, therefore, to first take a closer look at the presentation of slaves or servants in literary texts. In Egypt, professional activities tended to overlap with social groups, since individuals were often identified by the work they performed. From the Middle Kingdom on, literature became the vehicle to codify the values of the elites, torn between fidelity to state institutions, represented by the king, and the affirmation of individualism made possible by professional and economic success. In the eyes of the scribe, unconditional dependency on one's own labor appeared to be a feature of servitude. The human condition of the slave, whether called HM laborer, or bech, servant, let's see here. Where was I? Feature of servitude, or a bech servant, is alluded to in the satire of trades, also known as the instruction of Kati, after the name of the narrator, a classical literary text of early New Kingdom composed in order to describe the advantages of the scribal profession over all others. Here, different forms of forced labor, thematized peasants are drawn to work or obligated to work in the fields. The carpenter's children do not benefit from their father's hard work. A weaver is punished with 50 lashes for a day of absence from work, and a gardener is subject to a yoke. In spite of the lack of explicit references to slavery, the text provides evidence for a large-scale coercive work in Egyptian society, both in the public and in the private domain. In this sense, the hints in the satire of trades are corroborated by the separate address to living ones and servants. In the appeals to the living from the Old Kingdom, by the references to the status of the servant as opposed to the city dweller in the biographical text of the first intermediate period, as well as to the independent person of the land of Pharaoh, in legal documents of the Ramesses period, in the adoption papyrus, or by the accounts in the administrative papyrus, in the Brooklyn papyrus from the Middle Kingdom, which lists Egyptian and foreign servants called royal laborers, already document in the Ghibelline papyri, Posner Krieger, in private households. The term him, frequently translated as slave, also appears in the tales of the papyrus, Westcar papyrus, dated to the late second intermediate period for early New Kingdom. It refers to the private servants of one of the protagonists. He found him, let's see what it says. He found him lying down on a mat at the threshold of his house, a him or a servant or a slave at his head, massaging him, and another wiping his feet. That's at the Westcar, that's the Westcar papyrus. Talking about male servants wiping the hairs and washing the feet of Egyptian male servants. See, some of the things, some of the childishness and the immaturity when people go into the scriptures and read the scriptures and they see where Yeshua or Yahushua washed the feet of the disciples, they tried to allude it to some type of homosexuality or improper behavior. But we clearly see that it's a cultural practice in the desert lands. We clearly see that here in the Westcott Papyrus, that is clearly laid out the washing of feet of a male slave or servant by his upon his master. Should we assume that this is that this master who's having his feet washed by his male servant is a homosexual? Clearly, it's a practice in ancient Kemet. Clearly, it's a practice, especially wearing the open-toed sandals, walking bare feet, as we often see them depicted in hieroglyphics, walking bare feet in the desert lands. A lot of this stuff is childish. But we don't understand and we don't take into account the culture and the areas in which the biblical narrative was written, in which these people lived, as well as the Egyptian narrative and where they lived. This was desert land. Many famines occurred in these lands. That's desert land. Let's continue. It says slaves are also part of the range of human types presented in the wisdom text. Their condition is mentioned in the admonitions of Emperor or the Emperor. A New Kingdom text in which the cultural decadence of society from a centralized state to political and social chaos is crystallized in a series of oppositions between golden past and tragic present. Now even female laborers, and that, you know what? The admonitions of Emperor, what they're saying here, that the papyrus talks about older things that happened in the past and things that are happening in the future. And that's important for another conversation. But New Kingdom text in which the cultural decadence of society from a centralized state to political and social chaos is crystallized in the series of opposition between golden past and tragic present. Now even female laborers speak without restraint, and when their mistresses gives an order, servants show impatience. That's in the admonitions of Emperor. This rhetoric, Chasm speaks here for a semantic overlapping of the terms slave and servant, which is typical from the New Kingdom. Slavery in the broader sense appears to be an integral part of an Egyptian ideology. So why are we having people like Chris Harris talk about slavery is not common in ancient Kemet? It wasn't a common practice. Absolutely it was. We've gone through at least 4 or 5 papyrus already, just reading through this peer review article, mentioning the conditions and the beating of slaves in ancient Kemet, the selling of slaves in ancient Kemet. It was an economic base, slavery, and it happened in most ancient cultures. Slavery was an economic source, especially in a lot of agrarian or agricultural type of settings, where most people relied on people picking grain. Manual labor. So to say that slavery was uncommon in ancient Kemet is a falsehood. It's a lie. It's not true. And some will say, oh, I didn't say that there was no slavery. I just said it wasn't common. And then they'll say, well, you still haven't showed me any sense or any form of shadow slavery in your sources. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. So it's very disingenuous, and these guys have basically come out lying. You know, Jabari and Chris Harris and those of the like, who simply say that there were no slaves. I believe Shaka Amos may have been the only so-called Kemetic person that I've heard that will say that there were actual slaves in ancient Kemet, that they did use slave labor, and not this corvée system where you had servants who would come and work for a certain period of time and then would be allowed to return home. We're not talking about that class, that corvée, that class of coerced work. We're talking about perpetual slaves, not volunteer, but perpetual servitude, perpetual slaves, shadow slaves, who weren't being paid away oftentimes. Unlike those who would be called into corvée service in ancient Kemet. So to say that it was uncommon is fallacious. Absolutely fallacious. Ignorant to make that statement. Let me read that again. It says, slavery in the broader sense appears to be an integral part of Egyptian ideology. The second section of the loyalist instruction displays a consciousness of the elite's responsibility vis-a-vis the lower echelons of society, including servants, which echoes a Middle Kingdom letter to the dead in which a deceased is asked to let a female servant recover from illness. Isn't that crazy? Beginning with the first intermediate period, biographical text focuses on the patron's care for his household and laborers. I was the shepherd of my man, or servant man. Basically, that's what they're saying. Of good reputation in his town. Or his master. That's what he's saying. I'm sorry, his master. A healthy workforce and good work were guaranteed only when servants and laborers were well kept, as mentioned in the instructions of Ani of the late 18th dynasty. Do not acquire another person's laborer if he has bad reputation. What are you talking about there? This is what this author is talking about. The semantics that the ancient Egyptians played with their understanding of slave and servant. And here, let's get into now the documentary evidence. When turning to administrative records, 3 observations are in order. First, quantity and quality of the documentation vary considerably in space and time. There is a limited amount of material from the Old Kingdom, a few royal decrees, and the archive of Abusur. The evidence from the Middle Kingdom is richer. The abundant correspondence of Hakanat and the Papyri of El Lehuna, as well as important administrative texts, such as the already mentioned Brooklyn Papyrus. Even more material has survived from the New Kingdom, above all from Deir el Medina, the village housing the workers of the Theban necropolis. A substantial number of texts, less relevant for a discussion of slavery, has come to us from the late period. Second Egyptian documentation is distinctly empirical rather than conceptual in administrative texts. Attention is focused on single episodes rather than on general rules. Apart from some exemption decrees related to state temple property, attempts to reconstruct a legal code in the form of these documents had in Mesopotamia or classical antiquity are doomed to fail. Therefore, we mostly base our knowledge of ancient Egyptian social phenomena on punctual documentation. The picture, however fragmentary as it may be, turns out to be statistically fairly representative. Third, we should always keep in mind the Egyptian society was not a static entity, but evolved considerably during the 3,000 years of written documentation. During the Old Kingdom, the entire population, except for the elite, was kept under tight administrative control and could be drawn to corvée, work, or expeditions, as shown by the evidence of royal decrees. From the first intermediate period on, society was also characterized by a very thin layer of free people who viewed themselves in opposition to a lower class operating under various forms of institutional, economic, or professional coercion. In fact, it makes sense to speak of institutional or economic slavery only against the background of a recognizable domain of freedom and ostensibly not relevant dichotomy in official Egyptian discourse. Inferred from the autobiographical inscription of Henku at Del Gabari during the 6th dynasty, as for those who had been dependent in my service, their role became that of an official. Here, dependence refers to the recruited field worker. These were sometimes also employed as laborers in state enterprise, as shown by first dated graffito from Wadi Hamanat, or in military expedition as claimed by a nomarch. Let's see here. Mission carried out by the eldest son, and it reads, mission carried out by the eldest son of the king, the treasurer of the god, the general of the expedition. The Johnny known as Knefer, who took care of his men on the day of battle, who knew how to foresee the coming of the day of corvée recruitment. I distinguished myself among the multitude and carried out this task for Imhotep with 1,000 men of the royal palace, 100 men of the necropolis, 1,200 prisoners, and 50 engineers. His Majesty ordered all these people to come from the residence, and I organized this task in exchange for provisions of barley of all kinds, since His Majesty placed at my disposal 50 oxen, 200 goats for daily victuals. When His Majesty took action against the Asiatic sand dwellers, that's funny, His Majesty made an army of many tens of thousands from all of the upper Egypt, from Yebu in the south of Medinet in the north, and for lower Egypt from all the two sides of the house, and from Sidar and Kedesaru, and from Erijet Nubians, Medijet Nubians, Yam Nubians, Wawet Nubians, Kal Nubians, and from Tamulan, right? So in other words, they're going and bringing an army of tens and thousands from all over, but they're taking these people from the land of Nubia. These are Nubian slaves being brought into Kemet to fight. Exemption decrees such as the one from the Shur mentioned above also show that a portion of the population was exempt for compulsory military service and corvée duty and employed either in a royal funerary complex, such as the Pyramid Town, or in a religious foundation, as shown by the Abyssal Papyri. People involved in such activities are classed that also included priests and officials. You hear that? Who derive economic benefits from being exempt from corvée, bore the title of of the Hingites, those in front of the lake. Right? So we see that there is a social class. There's a social class, sort of a pyramid, right? With the pharaoh at the top, his viziers and army at the second, along with the priests and scribes. And then you had a working class, and then you had a slave class that were at the bottom of the pyramid structure in ancient Kemet. So again, to postulate that there was no slavery that existed in ancient Kemet was false, and to simply say that it was not a common practice is also fallacious. It's a lie. It's false. It's false. But let's get down to it. I wanted to read something else. All right. And if you really want to look, here is a glyph, and the determinative here tells you that this is a servant, right? Tells you that this is a servant. Why? Because you see the yoke around the neck. You see the yoke around the neck. That lets you know that ancient Kemet had slaves. You don't put yokes around the necks of free people. Let's get here. In the Old Kingdom, Egypt's population also included foreign prisoners of war called bond for life, or right? Let me with my pronunciation. From the time of Senefru, there's evidence of important expeditions to abduct. Hold on. You mean to tell me that we have ancient Egyptians during the time of the Old Kingdom, right? Calling, saying foreign prisoners, bond for life, but then also from the time of Senefru, there is evidence of important expeditions. Now, they had specific expeditions to do what? Abduct Nubians. Now, when we go into the scripture and we go to them and we show them in Exodus and Leviticus where there's a clear prohibition against Israelites against man stealing, Chris Harris, against man stealing, we clearly don't see any laws of Mayat being taught here or being used here by Senefru, who would have been the keeper of Mayat, the upholder, the guardian of Mayat. We clearly don't see him implementing any laws of Mayat against the institution of man stealing. But we clearly have him documented going into Nubian land, abducting Nubians for what? Nubians or Libyans to work as laborers or to serve in specialized military units. The ideological aspect of this phenomenon is represented by the so-called escalation texts or spells inscribed on terracotta figurines of the foreign princess for the foreign princess to be suppressed, as well as by the ritual of smiting the enemy and the release of prisoners of war with their arms tied behind their backs, documented throughout Egyptian history on the walls of temples. Prisoners captured during wartime and raids on occupied territory, initially in Nubia and then in Libya and in Asia as well, formed a large segment of the population in a state of servitude. These expeditions of who these, listen to what they were doing. They were calling these Nubians and Libyans and Asiatics prisoners of war. Now, mind you, these Nubians and Libyans and Asiatics during the time of Senefru weren't attacking Senefru and ancient Kemet, but Senefru was making specific expeditions to wage war against the Nubians and the Libyans and the Asiatics in their own land, going into their land to simply extract them for slave labor. And as they captured these people would defend themselves. And in defending themselves, then they would later be called prisoners of war in ancient Kemet. Ain't that about nothing? So you going into their land to simply make them slaves, and then when they defend themselves, you capture them, bring them back into your land, make them perpetual slaves. Because when I say perpetual slave, that's not an exaggeration. Listen, let's go back up here. What does it say? Prisoners of war called SKRWNI or screw NI, right? Escrew. They call them bound for life. Bound for life. So you would go into their land and create and have these big expeditions to simply go into their land to extract their loved ones and their families, to tell the families of the Nubians and the Libyans and the Asiatic people in these foreign lands, simply to bring them back to make them your slave. But it's not a common practice, Chris Harris. This is horrible. Clearly, we see evidence of man stealing. Where's your laws of Ma'at against man stealing? Where does any laws of Ma'at state, I have not stolen a man from another country or from his family? I can go into the scripture and clearly show you where the scripture talks about it's against the law to man steal, or to act upon man stealing someone from their own country. But here clearly it's condoned and practiced by Senefru in the Old Kingdom and many kingdoms to come afterward, as we will see. Really quickly though, let me get that. Let's get that. Right? Exodus 21:16. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. That's not simply talking about another Israelite stealing another Israelite. That's talking about stealing anyone. It says anyone. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. That practice that we just read about, Senefru creating these expeditions going into foreign lands, stealing specifically to steal Nubians and Libyans and Asiatics from their lands, simply to bring them and put them into forced slave labor. Exodus 21:16 clearly goes against that practice, going against this, clearly against that particular practice and that institution of slavery, of bounding men for life in servitude. Where's the laws of Ma'at against man stealing? I can show you here in the law, in the scripture here, Exodus 21:16, whosoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Show me your law of Ma'at that says that incorrect or that's wrong. Man stealing is wrong. Show me where Senefru, and show me where Senefru made that, and he probably has some funerary text where he says, "I have not stolen a man," lying, because that's all they were doing. And we're gonna get into that too. That these 42 negative confessions is exactly what they were. These were negative confessions, not for things you hadn't done, but these were negative confessions for things you had done in life. And that's another lie that they put out there. These negative confessions were things that they had done in life, especially from the Papyrus of Ani. When he talks about, "I have not done this and I have not done that." These are negative confessions of things that they had done in life, and they used it, and they had priests write these. They would go to these priests. They would confess, just as you see in the Catholic Church. They would confess to the priest their sins, and then the priest would write down in the book their negative confessions, and then he would write for them, saying, "If you want to pass from this life into the next, right, you're going to have to take this book with you, and you're going to read this to try to trick Osiris as you went before him, and your heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at." You would say these negative confessions in order to trick them, to get past them. That was the priest's purpose. That was his spell. That's what they were writing in those glorified obituaries, those Book of the Dead, or Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was so that you could recite it in your death, in your afterlife. You can recite these things, these spells, so that you can trick Osiris, and you can be and led on to the Dua, or you can be led on to the field of reeds. But those negative confessions, exactly what they were. The negative confessions, not positive confession. These were the negative confessions of things that you had done in your life. But let's get back to it. It talks about biographical text from the end of the Old Kingdom document, a meritocratic evolution, leading to the emergence of a new provincial upper class, who would also eventually become the leading elite during the first immediate period. Let me see, I think I read down here. Here I am, I'm sorry. Battle for life, let me get down here. Prisoners captured during wartime and raids on occupied territories, initially in Nubia, then in Libya and Asia as well, formed a large segment of the population. Biographical text from the end of the Old Kingdom document. Yeah, I was there. Meteor, right? This is what I want to get you right here. This is what I want to get you right here. Leading to the emergence of a new provincial upper class system, who would eventually become the leading elite during the first immediate kingdom period and the early middle kingdom. The new social fabric, however, also fostered new forms of servitude. Watch this. Watch this. For those of you who are comedic utopians, right? Listen to this. Widespread impoverishment and subsequent slavery in the private sector were caused by an insecure economy and temporary food shortage. The poor would borrow grain from the richer and lend on security. Women or other members of the family for the period in which interest were due. So are you meaning to tell me that if you were hungry in ancient Kemet, that in order to secure your loan to buy you something to eat, you could put your woman up, your wife or your female daughter, you could put them up for collateral? But they want to give us this idea that ancient Kemet had this equal society of both male and female with equal rights, that they were looked at as the same, that women weren't subjugated or looked at as possessions or property to be bartered. When we clearly see that here, here's the source, Moreno Garcia, 1998. Look it up. The poor would borrow grain from the richer and lend on security women or members of the family for the period in which interests were due. During the sixth dynasty, the architect Nekhebu says, I also kept for him, i.e. the king, the accounts of his personal possessions for a period of 20 years. I never struck anyone to let him fall beneath my hand. I never forced anyone to servitude. Watch this. The term servant therefore denotes a wide range of conditions, from the rhetorical used by high officials to indicate their loyalty to the king more than any other among his servants, to real servitude, as in the inscription of Hinku from Dar el-Gabari, in which the verb servant appears accompanied by the determinative of a seated man. That's what you see right here. This means servant, and this is the term, and this is the determinative here, right? This is the determinative here. Among his servants, the real servitude appears accompanied by the determinative of a seated man with a yoke around his neck. Where they do that at in a free society? And this is what I mean by when I say that they've lied. Now, why do you have this glyph for a servant, but then you have this determinative here of a man with a yoke around his neck? Yoke is indicative of burden and servitude. We can look, just going back to the transatlantic slave trade, and we see the shackles that were created, that they would place, or the wooden shackles or the iron shackles that they would place around the necks of the slaves being bought and taken from the west coast of the rice coast of Africa and taken over into the Caribbean and taken over into the islands and taken over to South America and taken over into the Americas, yoked around the neck like animals, like slaves, like shadow. Here's your determinative for a shadow slave right here, Chris Harris. Jabari, Priest Jabari. Here's your determinative for a shadow slave right here. A Nubian or a Libyan or an Asiatic yoked about the neck. Listen to this. And this is how we know that we lie, right? Because watch what he says right here, right? Watch what he says. Watch what he says. As in the inscription of Hinku from Del Ebar Gibari, in which the verb servant appears accompanied by the determinative of a seated man with a yoke around his neck. I have never forced one of your daughters to servitude. That Hinike explicitly refers to daughters may point to the fact that the women were the preferred form of deposit in case of food lending. The ethical expectation being that interest should not be levied too heavily on the borrower. Also, officials who would abuse their power could be punished with enslavement.
But you talk about what's not common. But we clearly see here women being used as collateral damage. There's a bartering chip. Value only to the interest of a few handfuls of grain.
The worth of a female's life. Right? Then let's look at this. I got a lot more here. But I'm just going to read this right here. And this is from the UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology. It says, the men at my father. Right, hold on, let me go back and read it. Let me go back and read this right here. Intermediate period in Middle Kingdom. In terms of social and intellectual history, the so-called first intermediate period displays the development of the individual initiative after having served in covert work as a lower priest. Mir becomes a free commoner. I did not let their water flood the fields of other people. I behaved like an efficient commoner, ensuring that my family had all the water they needed. Other examples in Moreno Garcia 2000, commoners are a characteristic feature of Middle Kingdom society. Right? It says of social differences. Every Egyptian, even a servant, is now called a man, an individual with dignity, even when he serves another person, as in the biography of Antipater, right? He says, the men at my father, Imhotep's service, were born at home. The property of my father and mother. Who's the property of his father and mother? The men that were born at his home. My men also came from my father's and my mother's property. And apart from those who belong to me, there are others I bought with my own means. So you're talking about chattel slavery, inherited slaves being passed down from generation to generation, and slaves being bought with his own money. Come on now, you can't tell me this is not a common practice. It may not have been common for those poor slaves. But clearly, they're being sold and bought in ancient Kemet, Nubians and Libyans, selling your brothers and sisters. Let's continue. Servants are defined as men, but treated like property. The radicalization of coerced labor at the end of the Old Kingdom now seems to have reached its apex in changing patterns of economic redistribution. Poor families would borrow grains from richer field owners and, short of paying back the borrowed amount, increasingly commit family members, especially women, to forced service in their owner's household. Moreno Garcia 2000. This also explains why so many biographical texts of the period emphasize the amount of dependents or personnel, as in the El Lahuna papyri, people representing a personnel appear closely related to each other, or workers accumulated during a lifetime. One person added 3 male workers and 7 female workers to those inherited from his father. Another individual even added up to even added up heads to his inheritance. In administrative texts from the Middle Kingdom, coerced workforces consisted of conscripts, fugitives, and royal laborers. The first two terms refer to soldiers and field workers conscripted to serve in the army or to labor in state building projects or agriculture. The most abundant documentation is offered by in the Rajna Papyrus and by the El Lahuna Papyri, which mention lists of prisoners being employed in state enterprises. The administrative text of the Bookland Papyrus displays them as subject to temporary coerced work on arable state land. The punishment for flight or absence was coerced labor for life. Order issued by the Great Prison. Now here's another lie that they often tell about ancient Kemet. Here's another lie, and I've heard Jabari say this specifically himself, if my recollection serves me correctly, that ancient Kemet had no prisons. There was no prisons in ancient Kemet. We didn't have prisons. You're lying. Or you simply have no understanding, or you're not well versed and well read, and you haven't really studied it. It says the order issued by the Great Prison in year 31, third month of the summer season, day 5, that he be condemned with all his family to labor for life on state land according to the decision of the court. That court family was called Mayat. So here we have a whole family, a whole entire family condemned to work for the state, condemned to coerced labor for life, perpetual slavery for life, a whole family condemned on the jurisprudence of Mayat. Where does Mayat dismiss or criticize chattel slavery? Where does Mayat say that it's wrong? Where is the law of Mayat against chattel slavery? It doesn't exist, because we clearly see Mayat being used by the officials, by the court, and their understanding of Mayat is righteous judgment. So this is reciprocity for this man missing, I guess, his time of course of corvée or coerced slave labor for a period of time, for being late or whatever, or for not showing up. His entire family is condemned to a life of servitude. Being sentenced to the Great Prison. Y'all can no longer ride that wave anymore, family. When they tell you ancient Kemet had no prisons, when they tell you they had no slave labor, when they tell you that they didn't bar, they treated women equally as men, that women weren't subjugated in ancient Kemet, they're lying. They're liars. They're liars, or they're dishonest, or they simply just are not aware of the information and therefore are not qualified to even have the conversation about whether or not the biblical narrative or the Bible condones slavery in any type of way. They're not worthy or not even qualified to have these biblical discussions, because they don't even understand their own Kemetic history that they study for truth. We just read where your seven principles just went out the damn window. Crazy. I'm going to read it again. For those of you who couldn't see it. As a matter of fact, let me blow it up so y'all can see it clearly. Let's read that. Let's read that again. Coerce able for life. If you were absent, if you were just absent from being called or being called to the draft, not for military service in this account, but simply building projects. If you missed that call to short for corvée, your whole entire family was condemned to slave labor. And the order issued by the great prison. Y'all see that? You see that, Jabari? The great prison? When you say ancient Kemet didn't have any prisons, they didn't have a penal system. In year 31, third month of the summer season, day 5, that he be condemned with all his family to labor for life on state land according to the decision of the court. And I'm gonna ask you again, that court was based on what? Ma'at. The 7 principles of Ma'at, according to you guys. But we clearly see in Ma'at condemning a whole family to slave labor for life. For life. Come on, family. Interestingly enough, it is not laborers or slaves that are treated as offenders of the state service, but their masters. Members of the middle class in the Book of Papyrus also provides information about royal laborers, whose feminine equivalent is Himwet, without royal attribution. Unlike privately owned servant workers, royal laborers were state-owned slaves. There again. Royal laborers were state-owned slaves who shared the status of Asiatics reduced to slavery as a result of military campaigns or trade. So when y'all guys argue about whether or not Israelites who are Asiatic, we are Asiatic, that they were not slaves, that there were no Asiatic slaves in Egypt, you're lying. You're lying. Royal laborers were state-owned slaves who shared the status of Asiatics reduced to slavery. They could be entrusted to individuals as property, almost always after trying to escape, although nominally belonging to the king. Their attribute royal recaptured fugitives like Asiatic slaves were assigned to the custody of a master who could give them away or leave them to his children. This is what he says: let my 15 people and property of prisoners associated to me be given to my wife, Seneptisi, in addition to the 60 that I gave her the first time. Now I make this gift to my wife to be deposited in the hall of the speaker of the city of the south as a contract that bears my seal and the seal of my wife Seneptisi. I am making this will for my wife, the woman of the eastern regions, Sheftu, daughter of Sapdu, called Teti, of everything given to me by my brother, the seal bearer of the director of the work, Ankrini, with all the goods as they should be, all that he gave me, she herself gave it to any of her children that she shall bear me. I am giving her the 4 Asiatics whom my brother, the seal bearer of the director of works, Ankrini, gave to me. She herself shall give them to any of her children that she wishes. Come on, family. Come on. I got so much more. I got so much more. So much more. Watch this. The ability to harm a child's health by using magical power could be imputed on women of foreign origin, regardless of their social status, whether servant or noblewoman. Although slavery was inherited, as we infer from the fact that Didi Sobek, son of the slave woman Adid, was himself a laborer. This did not prevent a slave from attaining a higher educational level. The communication is to inform my lord, who is occupying himself with your royal servant, Udrahu, teaching him to write without allowing him to flee. Come on, family. Where they do this at? Where they just lie about everything? Clearly we see slavery, subjugation. Shalom, Anonymous Hebrew. Shalom, DJ Black Charm. Shalom, Shalom. Yason, shalom, family. I just wanted to bring that out and just touch on these things, man. And touch on these things. I got a lot more on this. There ain't no running, ain't no hiding. Ain't no running, ain't no hiding of the institution of shadow slavery in ancient Kemet. Prison systems. Look at here, family. I got mounds of information on this. There's a figurine there of an Egyptian slave. Actually, an Asiatic slave. As a matter of fact, Semitic slave, an Asiatic. Get a good look at them, family. Look like our cousins, don't they? Right? And I'm building this this presentation based off of Antonio Luprino's work that I just got through reading from the University of UCLA. Like, there's no escaping this, brother. Listen, I wanted to bring this out too. This is also in his work. When he talks about, let me share my screen real quick. I think it's sharing. I think it's sharing. Let me go back to it. Listen to this, family. Let me put this on the big screen. Let me put this on the big screen. All right. Slavery in ancient Egypt. That's the figure from an Egypt of Semitic slave right there, family. It says the ancient Egyptians kept slaves. Many of them were captives of war. There was even a house of female slaves that produced them. Ben Haring of University of London wrote, "Chattel slavery is attested in Egypt from the late 3rd millennium BC onward. Persons could be bought and sold and inherited, and may thus be called slaves in the legal sense of the word. Although Egyptian terminology is vague, right? HM or him or him for the male and female, right? And bak, which means slave, or bak, which means servant, or baket, which means female servant, can both be translated as slave, but also as servant. Not only could the slave themselves be sold, but also their services. Ramesside texts refer to this practice with the expression day of service. From the late period onward, we know of the practice of individuals entering into slavery by contract as a means to pay off heavy debts." So we clearly see that there's varying forms of slavery. And so when the Bible talks about it and we see it here, are you calling it evil? You clearly see here that there's a reciprocity being had. Still waiting on your laws of Mayak to spell out it condemning chattel slavery. We can go on and on. We can go on and on. We can go on and on about this information. I got so much more that I'm definitely going to be getting into. I'm just going to do this probably in 3 parts, just so the brethren and sisters that are listening can have a point of reference of information. So when we hear these things, that it was not common, that slavery was not common in ancient Kemet, we know that's a lie. It was part of their culture, part of their ideology. It's what they believed in. So we're approaching the 8 o'clock hour. So that's it for me, family. Till next time. This will be part 1. I'll probably be doing it 3 parts. But again, peace and blessings, family. Hope you enjoy your Shabbat. You be safe for those of you who are traveling. This weekend. If you're not celebrating the holiday, Memorial Day holiday, you may be traveling because the heathens, they can give you the time off work. And so this may be a time for you to go spend with your families. I pray that the Most High give you safe travels over the highways and the byways. With that being said, peace, family.